So the first part of the notes of life in Mesopotamia is about the geography of the area. So Mesopotamia is a Greek word. It means between the rivers because the area was settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. As you can see, Mesopotamia is right here in the middle of this reddish color, and the Tigris and Euphrates are the two rivers that go in between there. It's basically modern day Iraq, and it was divided into different regions because of the different geographies. Some areas have mountains, some areas have more marshy land, and then they had different resources as well. So you can kind of see more up close and how that would fit in right over here. Here's the Tigris and Euphrates running through Iraq. So northern Mesopotamia is modern day Turkey, and it's made up of hills and plains. There are some rivers and streams that come from the mountains, and it has a rainy season that basically is going to water all the soil and help with the farmland. And so early settlers here would farm the land, and they also got timber, which is wood, and metals and stone from the mountains. Southern Mesopotamia is a lot hotter and drier. This is where the two rivers flow directly through the region. So it's kind of swampy, very wet land, wide, flat, and pretty barren. But it's where the majority of the civilization settled, was in this area. So between the rivers, you have the Tigris and Euphrates. The reason everyone wanted to settle here is because it allowed for irrigation. That means the watering of the soil all around it. So even though the river doesn't necessarily run up onto the plain, they can irrigate and water the land up there. So instead of just having these small settlements and small villages, you started to get cities. The first real cities started developing along these rivers. Instead of, 40 people settling in the area, it could be hundreds now. Unfortunately, this area did not have a whole lot of natural resources. So it was very important that you had good relationships and contact with the neighboring lands. These rivers allowed for people to trade and move from one area to the next so that they could get resources from other areas. It was filled with a lot of wildlife and edible vegetation, meaning plants, berries, fruits, whatever that they could eat. Then you have the Fertile Crescent area. That's this area in green up in the map. It is a part of Mesopotamia that is named for its shape because it looks like a crescent. If you think of like a crescent moon or crescent rolls, it's very easy to grow food here because the land is so fertile. There's so much water, whether it be the rivers going through or any of the, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf. Basically, you have access to water anywhere within that area. So it was very lush land to have farms, and this is where your largest cities and towns started to develop. You can actually see the picture at the bottom is a picture of more modern day Fertile Crescent area, but you can see how fertile the soil is, how easy it is to grow stuff. So it's kind of like prime real estate of the time. All right, so the government of Mesopotamia was mostly run by a king with nobles. These were the wealthiest people that made the laws. They declared war. They got to decide how to honor the gods and religious ceremonies. But they did have an assembly of the people. So kings had to be very smart because a lot of times we think about a king passing any rule that he wants and everybody just has to blindly follow it. But at this time, if the majority of the people didn't like what a king said, they could overrule the king and decide that what he said wasn't going to happen. So if a king did that enough and had enough people get upset, he would lose a lot of his credibility and power. So it's very important for the king to think about what the people wanted. All right, trade, we've already kind of discussed this, but it was very important because it was a way that they could get new things from other people. It was a time of celebration. So if you think about when you go on road trips and you leave Western North Carolina and you can go to a restaurant that we don't have here in this county or this area, and you get really excited about getting to go to a new place or see a new thing. That's kind of how trade was there. You got access to new resources, new materials, new people, new ideas. And they could use a system of barter where they could trade crops or materials that they had in their region for things that they wanted in a new region. There were four major social classes after the king. That would be the priests. These men would have shaved heads. They were very powerful, very important, and often they were doctors because people saw them as holy men who could then use the god's power to help heal others. You had the upper class, that's the wealthy nobles, and the lower class. All these people would have been able to dress decently, but you would have been able to tell who was wealthier by their clothes or their hair or jewelry. The lower class were the working class, more like blacksmiths, farmers, merchants, that kind of stuff. And then you had slaves. These were typically prisoners of war, and they did the majority of the work for the kings and nobles. Women actually had surprisingly a lot more rights than many people realize, because you often think about women not having rights at this time because they were not considered equal to men. However, they could leave their houses without a male chaperone. They could own property, they could own businesses, they could go to court. They were even allowed to learn how to read and write. The biggest thing they couldn't do was vote or be a part of the government. So they didn't have a say in what was happening, but they could take part in what was happening, which was kind of unusual for the time. Your homes, every family had its own home. It was usually about 3 stories high because the entryway, as you can kind of see some of these arches, would have been like a courtyard, place for people to play. It's almost like your own yard, place for people to play, for your animals. And then the top 2 floors would have been for people to live, hang out, um, sleep, that kind of thing. And then they would have these flat roofs so that that's almost like an added patio, and they could build up a mountainside like this. Schools. People were able to send their children to school primarily to learn how to read and write. We didn't have the same subjects we have now, but the biggest things you needed to learn were reading and writing. These schools were run by priests, and only the boys could go to school. They were very tough. Lessons were reinforced with beatings. So if you taught some material and a student wasn't picking up the information, the priest would beat the student and then retest them. And if the kid still wasn't learning the information, they would beat them again. Same with bad behavior. They figured if you got enough beatings, you would learn not to do something. They were a polytheistic people. That means they had many gods. They had gods that specialized in one city or one job, like a god of lawyers, a god of teachers, a god of, doctors, whatever it might be. And that god would be the person you would pray to that would protect you. Same with each city had a god that was in charge of protecting it. And for fun, they had board games, things like checkers. They are actually the ones that invented checkers, usually made of clay, dice, that kind of thing. They played a lot of the same stuff that we think of still to this day. They had hunting, boxing, wrestling, racing. They liked music and dancing. They had slingshots, bow and arrows. They liked to play house, jump rope. So, really, a lot of the things that we think of today, we owe to Mesopotamia. And a lot of stuff that is a part of modern day society came from these people. So it's important that you understand where they originated.